Congressman Tom McMillen earned his Bachelor of Science degree at the University of Maryland, where he was a three-time All-American in basketball and a member of the 1972 United States Olympic team. He graduated Pi Beta Kappa in 1974 and had the honor of delivering his class commencement address. Tom McMillen was the first University of Maryland student to be awarded the coveted Rhodes Scholarship, on which he attended Oxford University and received an MA in politics, philosophy, and economics. He was elected to the 100th Congress in November 1986 and serves on a number of congressional committees, including the Committee on Banking, Finance, and Urban Affairs, and the Science and Space and Technology Committee. He is a member of the Environmental and Energy Study Conference, the Congressional Caucus on Women's Issues, and the Congressional Arts Caucus. Congressman McMillen was born in Elmira, New York on May 26, 1952. Happy birthday, Tom. And resides in Crofton, Maryland. I am pleased to introduce to you Congressman Tom McMillen.
Thank you very much, Bob, for that kind introduction and this low podium. For a moment there, I thought you might, in fact, be expecting Senator Barbara Mikulski instead of myself. My good friend, President Forestano, faculty, distinguished guests, and especially the graduating class of 1988. It's truly a pleasure for me to be here tonight with you on this notable occasion. You know, quite frankly, I wasn't sure whether I should come here tonight. When I opened up the newspaper this morning and read my horoscope, incidentally, only because it's my birthday, I might add, it said, "Try harder to communicate with those whose thoughts might be elsewhere." How many of you, by the way, read the newspaper today? If you did, you were probably bombarded with negativism. On any given day, you can read about such cheery things as, truly, in the last couple days, a 30% chance of rain today, never 70% chance of sunshine. A 93% increase in the rate of skin cancer in the past 8 years, yet rarely any figures on how many lives advances in health care have saved. Another airline disaster, while never a report on how many routes were traveled safely. This kind of negative attitude today runs rampant. Clearly the cynicism and negativism that are so pervasive are not without foundation. With a $1 trillion federal deficit that continues to grow, an ozone layer that is being so quickly destroyed that we will lose almost 40% of it by the end of your lifetime, resulting in 154 million more cases of cancer, a disease that is only 7 years old, yet has already claimed 30,000 lives, and for which a cure is still a dream, and with an arsenal equaling 3 tons of TNT suspended over every man, woman, and child on this earth, making the threat of nuclear holocaust ever present. I suppose you can conclude that there does exist a basis for negative attitudes. And given such conditions, a visitor from another planet might very well conclude that after this ceremony, you should all go back to your rooms, lock the door, and swallow the key. Believe me, Roger Dangerfield was right on the mark when he said, "It's a jungle out there." Yet, you know something? We must put today's environment and all these challenges into perspective. Every generation in this country has had phenomenal obstacles to confront and overcome. At the turn of the century, you would have graduated from college only if you were the privileged few. A person graduating in 1918 was fortunate not to have been one of the more than 500,000 who died of influenza. The 1933 graduate, in the height of the Depression, in the depths of the Depression, looked for a job when 25% of the workforce was unemployed. In 1945, you would not have had to worry about which job to take. You would have been drafted into a world war which would take the lives of 1 out of 3 of your colleagues. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis took the world to the brink of nuclear disaster, and even as recently as 1974, the year I graduated from college, the oil crisis forced people to wait 2, 3, 4 hours just to fill up their gas tanks. Daunting then and even now, these obstacles were nevertheless hurdled. While after each hurdle another challenge arose, that challenge was subsequently conquered as well. And education, I think, should teach us that in fact these problems are solvable. We know how to reduce our national debt, and we will. Our doctors will find a cure for AIDS. And we seem to have a Soviet leader who appears to want to move to make United States and Soviet relations and take them into a new direction. It's easy to be pessimistic and negative about this world, but as you graduate today, the most important thing to remember is that the most critical determinant of your success will be your outlook on the world. Your attitudes are crucial to your success. An analysis was recently done of 100 very, very successful entrepreneurs. These people ranged in age, differed in experience and careers, all kinds of different education background, but the distinct commonality was that they were all good finders. That is, they all shared a positive view of the world and saw good in their future. Even in public service, people respond to good finders. Psychologists at the University of Pennsylvania measured the level of pessimism in the nomination acceptance speeches by candidates in 1948 and every succeeding presidential campaign, with only one exception. The more optimistic candidate always won. People, quite frankly, are tired of negativism. Ralph Waldo Emerson, I think, said it best when he noted that what lies behind us and what lies ahead of us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us. A study by Harvard University revealed that 85% of the reasons why people succeed, why they accomplish things, why they get promotions and so forth, were due to their attitudes, and only 15% is due to their technical expertise or aptitude. Obviously, the most critical tool that you have to meet the challenges you will confront is your attitude. And that's really what I want to talk to you today about, are a few areas of attitude development that I think are critical to your career paths. The first area is goal setting. You must have an idea of where you're going in life. Can you imagine Sir Edmund Hillary, the first man to scale the top of Mount Everest, explaining how he accomplished that awesome feat? Do you suppose he explained it by saying he was just walking around one day and ended up on top of the tallest mountain in the world? Or consider the chairman of the board of General Motors saying, well, I just kept coming to work every day and pretty soon they promoted me to the top. That's ridiculous, but it's no more ridiculous than thinking you can accomplish anything significant without specific goals. Success has been defined as a progressive realization of a worthy goal. So set your sights on a fixed beacon, a lodestar, remembering at the same time that you have to innovate, be flexible, and adapt to new realities. Back in 1974, a man named Jimmy Carter, a peanut farmer from Georgia, was known by less than 1% of the American public. 2 years later, he was proudly inaugurated as President of the United States.
Clearly, Jimmy Carter had a goal and stuck to it. Most of the time, amazingly, that is what it's all about. My second point is that during the course of striving to meet such goals, you will sometimes encounter seemingly countless obstacles, setbacks, and pitfalls. When I was 7 years old, I remember vividly my father taking me to see our orthopedist doctor because I was complaining of leg pains. After examining my legs and knees in particular, he told my father that because of a congenital knee defect, I might never run, and certainly I could never play competitive sports. 250,000 jump shots later, I think that he would have to admit that he was off the mark. But nevertheless, my doctor's prediction was depressing news for a 7-year-old who was growing like a beanstalk. Success will depend on whether you will be deterred or stopped. In the face of obstacles, you must reach to reaffirm your goals and dreams. Perhaps most importantly, never let the fear of failure debilitate you. Let your failure spring you towards greater achievement. There's a story about the great violinist Paganini, who was performing before a distinguished audience when suddenly a string on his violin snapped. The audience was startled, but the master musician, unruffled, continued to play on the remaining strings. Without warning, another string snapped. Still, Paganini played on without hesitation. Then, with a sharp crack, a third string snapped. The audience sat in silent bewilderment. For a brief moment, the artist stopped, raised his famous Stradivarius violin high in one hand, and with the furious skill and the matchless discipline of a superb craftsman, finished his selection on a single string with such perfection that the audience gave him a tumultuous ovation. Paganini's lesson to us is very simple. Never let obstacles get in your way as you march towards your goal. The third point that I'd like to make is that for every adversity that you will inevitably encounter, you must not only be deterred, but you must reap a greater set of benefit from these obstacles. I had the honor to attend in 1972 the Olympic Games in Munich, Germany, as a member of the United States Olympic team. Participating in the Olympics, quite honestly, was a lifelong dream for me. But these Olympics were marred by disaster, tragedy, controversy, and disappointment. As you might remember, though more likely have been told, these were the Olympics in which the members of the Israeli Olympic team were murdered by Palestinian terrorists. The final basketball game itself that I participated in between the United States and the Soviet Union was highly contested and controversial. The last few seconds of the game were replayed 3 times, and in the end, the gold medal went to the Soviet Union. Being a part of the first United States Olympic basketball team to lose the gold medal, and especially under such ridiculous circumstances, was a tremendous disappointment to me. I felt that our team had let our nation down. But from my lowest hour have come some of my most poignant memories, and those Olympic Games fundamentally shaped my life. I experienced firsthand the terrorism in recent years that has so rocked the world. I learned of the far-reaching arm of politics, and that even the sports arena is not divorced from its touch. And yes, I learned a lot about the world. Fourth, on the road to success, there is no substitute for hard work and perseverance. When I was a boy, Bill Bradley, now a United States Senator, someday I think President of the United States, and then a star basketball player at Princeton University, and one of the greatest college basketball players ever, told me that he always practiced so hard because he was afraid that somewhere, someplace, someone else was practicing when he wasn't. And he was afraid that when he met that person in competition, that he would lose. That was a lesson I took to heart. It shaped my sports career and still stays with me. And I want to tell you one more sports story that proves the point about perseverance. I hope you'll indulge me in bringing these sports stories up, but some of my most vivid memories come from those experiences. 9 years ago, I remember entering Boston Garden during Larry Bird's rookie season. Larry Bird, one of the greatest basketball players ever. This was hours before the game, and Larry Bird was out on the court all by himself shooting 30-foot jump shots. I thought to myself, kind of curiously, who is this corn cob from Indiana? Needless to say, Larry Bird that night went on to score 30 points, and he beat our team pretty badly. 7 years later, before my last game against the Boston Celtics, Larry Bird was still out there alone before the game, an hour and a half before anyone was there, still by himself taking 30-foot jump shots. He had not forgotten how he got there. And lastly, have confidence in your abilities. I will never forget how I felt on election night a year and a half ago. My campaign manager knocked on my door, came in, and solemnly told me to prepare a concession speech. Dan Rather had just come on CBS National News and announced that I was down by 10,000 votes with little time left and predicted defeat. For a moment I was stunned. I stopped and reflected on the endless campaign appearances, the thousands of handshakes, the telephone calls, the speeches. I dedicated years to this goal and was watching it go down in narrow defeat. But remembering the old adage, the opera's not over till the fat lady sings, I refused to write that speech. And funny enough, an hour went by, and an hour and a half went by, and the election slowly turned around. And that night, God willing, I was able to win a landslide victory of 426 votes. So today, I guess the lesson of that is when you're most vulnerable, be confident, stand strong, and have faith in your abilities and yourself. Like other great leaders of this country, from Washington to Lincoln to Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy projected a great aura of confidence. When I was playing for the Bullets my last season, I was on the team bus going into Dallas to our hotel, and I looked up at the plaza in the building where John F. Kennedy was shot from, and I turned to my teammate and said, I'm always moved when I go by this site. Think of that day, I remember it like yesterday, when Kennedy was shot. My teammate turned to me and said, I'm too young to remember John F. Kennedy. I wasn't born then. I knew at that time that I was too old for the NBA. But I also knew that most of you were born years after President Kennedy's death. But he spoke to you in 1960 when he said, it's time for a generation of leadership to cope with new problems and new opportunities, for there is indeed a new world to be won. That positive vision of the future of the world, and more importantly, of your future, that should sustain you as you go ahead. Congratulations, good luck, and thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm Hal Cunahan. I'm the Assistant Dean for Social Sciences at Anne Arundel Community College. On behalf of the Social Science Forum, I'd like to welcome you here today to discuss your concerns about the war with Iraq and the future of the Persian Gulf region and the post-war environment. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce some of our instructors who are here today. From our Political Science Department, Dr. E.B. Duffy is here. Professor Jack Shilkert is here from our Psychology Department, and Dr. Frank Alduino is here from our History Department. Our guest today is Congressman Tom McMillen. Congressman McMillen is in his third term representing Maryland's 4th Congressional District. He's a graduate of the University of Maryland. He's an amateur athlete, a former professional basketball player, a member of the 1972 United States Olympic team. He's a Rhodes Scholar. And most importantly to us, he's a long-term and very, very good friend of Anne Arundel Community College. Congressman McMillen is going to take a few moments to give some opening remarks, and then after that, he will address your questions. Please welcome Congressman Tom McMillen.
Thank you and good morning. It's Nice to be back to Anne Arundel Community College, and I certainly appreciate all of you coming out this morning to talk a little bit about some of the recent events, certainly historic and exciting in terms of our history, and I'm sure in your lifetimes you probably won't have too many weeks like we've just had transpire. So I think it is important to talk about it and put it in some sort of historical perspective and talk about what it means for the future. I thought back when I was driving over here about when I was in college, and it was not too long ago, back in the early 70s, but it was a dramatically different kind of situation. It's really hard to appreciate, but it was as if America was at war in a similar kind of deployment, but the reaction domestically was just absolutely 100% differently. In fact, at the University of Maryland, where I went to school, there was routinely every afternoon tear gas had to be applied to break up the demonstration. So I remember I always had to close my room window in the afternoons because the tear gas got to be somewhat disruptive from my studies. But it's hard for you to appreciate that, to be on a college campus and to imagine the fact that you had to be tear gassed to break up demonstrations against the war. Quite a different situation today, because one of the things that I think this war has done is we have shed some of that Vietnam complex. And you know something, I'm somewhat of a Jeffersonian. I do believe the people are ultimately have great wisdom, and I think in retrospect they probably had great wisdom about Vietnam, and really the question seriously why we were sending 50,000 of our bravest and finest to die in a war in Southeast Asia for questionable purposes. But I think the fact remains that the war that we just gone through, I believe, very firmly had much more reason, much more purpose behind it. And I think that is why we were able to generate the kind of public support in this country. And there is really a very important thing in democracy. If you do not have that public support, going to war is a very, very problematic matter. Well, let me just make a couple of brief comments. One of the things that I think I related right there is a real connection in our country between going to war and popular support. And it really goes back to when our Constitution was formed. There was great tension between the formation of the executive and the legislative branch, who should have the power to go to war. And our founding fathers were rebelling against the fact that a monarch could take his country to war, or that a dictator like Saddam Hussein could take his country to war and wreak havoc on his nation without any sort of accountability to the people. So in Article 1 in the Constitution, clearly the power to go to war was vested in Congress, and in Article 2, the president was appointed commander-in-chief. But nevertheless, we've had 200 instances of conflict and in our nation's history where we've actually gone into hostilities, but we've only had 5 declared wars. And those wars were World War I, World War II, Spanish-American War, the Mexican-American War, and the War of 1812. 195 of those were without declarations of war. So you can see the conflict. And one of the problems as we went into the Congress this past January was the president's insistence that he didn't really need a congressional approbation to do what he had to do in the Persian Gulf. I think that would have been a mistake. I'm glad the president came to Congress for a vote. And when he asked for the power to use force, it was kind of a unique circumstance in history, because we weren't really declaring war in that congressional resolution. What we were saying to the president was that once you exhaust all diplomatic means and report back to Congress such, you have the right to use whatever necessary means to get Iraq out of Kuwait. So it was almost a conditional declaration of war. It wasn't really a declaration of war. It was sort of an empowerment, if you will, of the president, giving him clear and concise terms as to when he could go to war. So that was a very, very difficult debate. I think one of the great things about our country is that we were able to have that debate. We were able to have that divergence of opinion in this country, yet once we reached a conclusion, we were able to rally our nation behind our troops, behind our president, and prosecute this war with vigor and speed. I supported the president because, quite honestly, I felt that given the history of watching Saddam Hussein through the 80s, I never felt that sanctions or anything close to sanctions would work in expelling him from Kuwait. Kuwait was just too big a prize for Hussein to back away from it. He had studied America very closely. He had seen Vietnam. He knew America's patience was very, very short and thin. He knew that America could not sustain losses, casualties. He knew America would tire of a war after a certain period of time. And he also knew that America was extremely myopic. And as soon as it could, it would shift to the next subject or the next problem on the horizon. So what he did, he took a calculated gamble that he would grab a hold of the 97 billion barrels of reserves of Kuwait, which amounts to, at $20 a barrel, about $2 trillion of wealth. And he wasn't going to give that up for economic sanctions or anything close to it. And we later found that out. He tried it once before in 80 against Iran. He wanted Iran's oil reserves because he knew, quite honestly, that he could cement his position in history if he could get a hold of more oil wealth and use that oil wealth to build up a massive military. That is exactly what he did to his own country. His own country has tremendous wealth, 100 billion barrels of reserves, $2 trillion, but yet he used most of it not to help the Iraqi people, but to build up a tremendous military. And so what has happened is he, I think, was unwilling to let go of that prize, and as we've seen, it took armed intervention to do so. I think what's going to happen as the next couple weeks unfold, and we see the atrocities that have been perpetrated on the Kuwaiti people, I think greater support for the war will even be engendered. The very fact of what he has done and the brutalities that he's done against the Kuwaiti people, fellow Arabs, is really just mind-boggling. And you will see that he is clearly a madman and will have to eventually be removed from power, in my view. That's going to be somewhat of a thorny issue, but he will not be allowed to stay in power once, I think, all these revelations are unfolded. So why don't we stop there? There's lots of things we could talk about, lessons about this war, what the post-war is going to look like. We can talk about the congressional resolution if you'd like to know more about it. We can talk about some of the plans and the aftermath, some of the costs, but I figured it would be more important, since we have about a half an hour, to hear what your concerns are. And why don't we begin? Do you have a glass of water? Anybody have any questions at all?
My name is Paul Dombravo. Congressman McMillen, what are the sanctions set in forth now that would be able to bring Saddam Hussein to trial as a war criminal in respect of his obvious lack of sanctity for life, not only for his own country, but also for the wreckage that's going to be left for hundreds of years with the environment?
He has, as you said, wreaked havoc on humanity and on our planet. And there's lots of things that can be done. One of the things that we did, I think, very wisely was that when we treated their POWs, we treated them with great care and with with an emphasis on pursuing and following the Geneva Protocol. And by doing so, we send them back home with a different taste in their mouth. I think those many Iraqi prisoners will go back and tell a different story than Baghdad Radio has been telling. The sanctions can continue really for the long term if we wanted to, until Saddam Hussein was removed from power internally. And I think that is really the intent of our government. They can really close this country off from all commerce. You can't really rebuild your country unless you can get your oil revenues back up. So that is very much a possibility. It seems to me General Schwarzkopf is going to move. We've occupied part of Iraq. We will move out of Iraq once the troops and the POWs are exchanged. But I think the economic leverage we have is sizable if Iraq ever hopes to get out of this abyss that it's found itself in. Clearly, it has to be up to the Iraqi people to remove him. And as you know, in Iraq, there is a tremendous fundamentalism in the Muslim world. You have the Shiites and the Sunni Muslims, and the Sunnis are the ones who are basically in control, but now you see the Shiites beginning to exert themselves. Iraq is a country of about 17 million people. It's about the size of 3 Marylands in terms of population. What has happened is in the last probably 10 years, over the course of 2 wars, Saddam Hussein has probably killed 1/10 of his population through war and everything else. And he's, as I said, wreaked terrible havoc on his people. So I think the economic leverage is a very, very effective one. In addition, you know, the UN resolutions demand that Saddam Hussein and Iraq pay reparations. And that's a very tricky issue because you know, we have to give a lot of thought to this. One of the things that we obviously need to think about is if Saddam Hussein is removed from power, do you still want to penalize the Iraqi people? I can only say that if history is any guide, after World War I, we did that to Germany in the Versailles treaties, and what happened was the reparations that we imposed upon the German people led to the rise of Adolf Hitler, and the great animosity of Germans for the world led to World War II. In contrast, after World War II, we executed a Marshall Plan whereby we came in and helped Japan and Germany, and we were able to establish fledgling democracies in both those countries. I'm not saying that the United States should go in and rebuild Iraq. I agree with the president on that, but clearly the Arab world should think about, if Saddam Hussein is removed from power, trying to help Iraq get back on its feet. To have a country push back into the Stone Ages is not necessarily good for the Middle East or good for the world. So it's one of the considerations we have to think about.
Congressman McMillen, Darling Peckman, you answered one of my questions. How would the people of Iraq be treated after this? And I'm glad to see that we feel that we will treat them with humanitarian things because, as you say, an overcome people, they will be that. My question then is, how much of a military force will we keep in the Gulf over there?
Well, Secretary Baker was asked that yesterday on Meet the Press, and he really didn't give an exact answer. And the reason why is because I think he wants to hear from our Arab partners who have a greater stake in the region as to what they want and what objectives they want for the region. I think it's wrong for the United States to come in there and again impose its security arrangements on the Arab states. We need to talk to the Saudis and to the Syrians, to the Egyptians and to the Emirates, who are going to be pivotal in this, and figure out what they think is necessary. Clearly we need enough to be a deterrent, but not enough to destabilize. Too much could, in fact, destabilize. If you have too many Americans, too many allied countries, you know, that's the whole infidel thing that Saddam Hussein was railing against. So I believe that it has to be done in close concert with our partners. I don't think it'll be a lot. I think that you'll see some increased naval presence. I think we will pre-deploy equipment and supplies, so that if we ever find ourselves where we found ourselves on August 2nd, that it won't take such a lengthy amount of time to deploy our troops and assets in the region. I think we will have pre-deployed assets. We'll probably have some increased air power in the region, but I don't think we're going to have a lot of troops over there, to be quite honest. I think we'll have the ability to readily respond if something would happen.
So would you say that the United States will be carrying the major financial part of that then, or will that be shared among?
I think it'll be shared. I don't think the United States will carry the major portion of that. Quite honestly, as we get out of NATO, we'll probably just reposition some of it southward to the Persian Gulf. But I mean, we're backing out of places like Korea and Japan and NATO. So, and quite honestly, it's probably more important that we be in the Persian Gulf than in some of those places right now.
My concerns are with future military protection. To what extent will the budget cuts affect the military and the Persian Gulf?
Well, you know, we have to come to grips with the fact that we have some serious deficit problems in this country, and you know, we can't continue to finance any part of our government with borrowed money for the long term. I mean, in essence, what we're doing is we're borrowing money from Japan and the rest of the world so that we can build up our defenses and pay for our domestic programs. And I think that we have to sort of realize that we can make some changes in our defense spending without necessarily hurting our defense posture. One of the things I just raised is that, you know, with a couple million troops in uniform, we can reduce that, particularly deployments around the world, in Japan, in Korea, in NATO. We can bring some of that. We can demobilize quite a bit of that. We can also try and downsize our military, use our reserves more, and do those kinds of things to save some costs. You know, we're spending $100 billion a year in NATO, and I mean, although the equipment is necessary in there, it's not necessary that we maintain those deployments for the long term. So we can still downsize our military, I think, without necessarily suffering or making us incapable of responding like we did in the Gulf. But we have to realize that we're going to have to face some of these cutbacks in the near term. That's not to say that we're going to have a dramatic cutback in defense. We're going to spend still close to $300 billion a year, which is a lot of money on defense. So I'm still optimistic that we can respond like we did in the Gulf in the next 3 to 4 years, even given the kind of curtailments that may be necessary.
Thank you.
My name is Philip Annis. Congressman McMillen, one of the items that you stated was that the economic effect that it would have had on this country if Hussein had continued on moving Saudi Arabia, the oil prices would have magnified even more intensely, which would have hurt us deeply. If his attack on Kuwait had not affected us economically, would this country have been as adept to send in our American troops, put them in the firing line? If it had not hurt our country so bad, would we have cared if the Kuwaiti people had been squashed?
Well, I think that's a legitimate point. I mean, there are lots of reasons why you go to war. You know, you ask yourself the questions about Vietnam and Korea. You just try and think back historically why we went to war. And when you look back at it, it seems kind of foolish, I hate to say, somehow stopping the domino effect of communism. Well, I mean, if history were to tell us of something, the domino effect is in reverse. I mean, communism is unraveling, not is contracting, not expanding. But we didn't know that back in the 50s, and we didn't know that back in the 70s. But we made more of the threat than we probably should have at the time, in retrospect. When you look at the Persian Gulf and you look at what was involved here, you know, a lot of people don't want to say this, but I will. That is, a good portion of the reason why we went to war is because of the profound effect it could have on our country and the free nations of the world. And a lot of that was economic. I hate to say, you know, when you talk about a $40 barrel of oil, that oil premium probably will cost the free world $100 billion just in economic costs. I was struck by a comment by President Havel from Czechoslovakia, who said that the oil cost increase from the Persian Gulf were going to cost his country probably $1 billion more. And he said, my little country of Czechoslovakia can't afford that. That may push me over the edge. And here we think we've spent 40 years trying to free these countries up in NATO, only to have them pushed back again because of oil prices and the fact that they're destabilized. Now, I think one of the grave mistakes that we made was to not get off of this dependency on oil in the Persian Gulf. We had many opportunities, many warnings in the 70s. We decided not to do it in the 80s. We had a president who felt that the marketplace would solve the problem. Well, it didn't solve the problem. The Japanese showed us that you had to have a national strategy to really wean yourself off of oil. We didn't do that. And so the fact is that I can't sit here and say, you know, we can do away with history. History has brought us to today, and today, although we are not as dependent on Persian Gulf oil as the Japanese or other nations, we are dependent on oil. And oil is a fungible commodity, and when the price of oil goes up, all prices go up, not just Persian Gulf oil. See, a lot of people think, oh, America's only getting 4% of its oil from Iraq and Kuwait. What difference does that make? Why should that affect us so much? It doesn't work that way. If Iraq and Kuwait's oil is shut off, the price of oil all over the world goes up. The spot market of oil goes up. Mexican oil goes up. Domestic crude in Texas goes up. So what happens is consumers all across the world start paying $40 a barrel for oil. And it has a real effect on your economy. I mean, I can't tell you in terms of bank failures, in terms of airline failures, in terms of all that, how much of that has been predicated on oil. So when you go over there and you say, why are we at war? We're at war for lots of reasons. One is because it was a sort of an international UN condemnation. Secondly, economic, because Saddam Hussein's truly had his hands on a stranglehold on the world economy. Three, we're over there because because of atrocities and so forth, but not only because of that, because there's atrocities going on all over the world, as you say. So it's, I think the reason why we're there is sort of for many reasons. But you cannot dismiss the economic reason.
My name is Alex Pfeiffer, Congressman McMillen, and I have two questions. The first question deals with the release of PWs. There are approximately 50 PWs, all told. Certainly not more that the Iraqis have. Why the slowness?
Well, I don't know if you heard the news this morning, but they
10.
Yeah, 10 have been released.
But why the tardiness in releasing all of the PWs?
You have to understand, Iraq's command and control has totally been destroyed. I mean, I doubt that they have communication, effective communication with far out parts of their country that they may not even know the whereabouts of all POWs. We have given them a list of our missing in action, and they're trying to, I'm sure, find out what happened to them. But I doubt that. I think because of the chaotic circumstances in their country that it's going to take a while for them to put it together. And if I had to ascribe a reason to it, that would be the reason. They seem willing to release the POWs mutually, and I see no reason that they're holding that up for any reason other than the one I mentioned.
Good. Yeah. My second question deals with what effect do you think this will have on the MIA issue of the Vietnam era?
Certainly, I know the State Department has a very active desk working on that issue, and I know that members are still involved in going over. Sonny Montgomery, congressman from Mississippi, went over recently, and where they found the remains of a number of POWs and brought them back home. So that's still being worked on. It doesn't get as much coverage, but it is still being worked on. I know that a congressional delegation went over to bring a number of remains home, so that's still an issue that's being worked on.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Good. I want to thank Congressman McMillen for taking time out of his busy schedule to be with us, and I want to thank you, too, for coming, particularly the students who took time to think of some thoughtful questions. As you know, this is being videotaped. It's going to be used in all of our classes in the social science division, and that's going to give our instructors and our other students a lot of food for thought. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.